Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, Workplace Violence in 2020. The information presented by the experts is not to be used as legal advice and does not indicate a working relationship with the experts. So all materials obtained from this presentation are merely for educational purposes and should not be used in the court of law. Stands the expert's consent, i.e. a business relationship where she or he is hired for your particular case. In today's webinar, Larry and Marianna will discuss the definitions, record keeping, trigger of events, case studies, resources, and conclusions. To give you a little background about our presenters, Larry Fennelly is an authority on security planning and analysis, the study of how environmental factors contribute to criminal victimization on the use of physical hardware, alarms, lighting, site design, and management practices. Larry is also a litigation consultant and an expert on security policies and procedures and guard management. In 1982, Mr. Fennelly was appointed to President Reagan's task force on crime prevention and violent crime, which explored what the private sector was doing to prevent crime and what was being done for employees who were victims of crime. Our presenter, Marianna Perry, is a certified protection professional through ASIS International and has more than 35 years of progressive experience in law enforcement, physical security, safety, and loss control. Marianna received her BA degree from Bellarmine University and her master's degree from Eastern Kentucky University. She is a safety and security consultant and is a frequent presenter at the annual ASIS International Seminar. Marianna is a former trooper and detective with the Kentucky State Police and was previously the director of the National Crime Prevention Institute at the University of Louisville. She is a member of the ASIS International School Safety and Security Council. Attending to require a passcode, the word for today is violence. During the Q&A session, we ask that you enter this passcode into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. The Q&A is located to the left of your screen. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself and stay for the full 60 minutes. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Please note that CLE credit cannot be given to those watching together on a single computer. Tomorrow morning, I will send out an email with the link to the archive recording of the webinar. The slides can be downloaded from the resource list at the widget at the bottom of your screen. Thank you all for attending today, and Larry and Marianna, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to tell you that we're really excited about being here and talking to you all today. Let me go with the first slide here. And what I wanted to tell you and to start off is that when we talk about workplace violence incidences, many of them sometimes turn into active shooter situations, and then they later on have created massive liability potential for victims' lawsuits. This has been affecting hospitals, healthcare facilities, government agencies, retirement facilities, and retail stores. And no, I'm not talking about just coronavirus that's going on, because we're starting to see lawsuits regarding that as well. So here we have the definition per OSHA of workplace violence. Workplace violence, in my opinion, can occur anytime, anywhere, even within the best preventive programs an organization has put together. An organization can never really eliminate the threat of some type of violence from occurring. However, the threat of violence can be reduced if problematic behavior is reported and are identified early and dealt with in the appropriate manner. I like the way what I just read to you has to say about appropriate manner. I've worked for corporations where we've had problems with employees, and they've had problems with restraining orders for their against their spouses. And also, I've been in the opposite room on the other side of the wall when HR has terminated individuals. So here, this definition about on workplace violence, it refers to it as acts or threats of violence ranging from verbal abuse to physical assaults towards persons at work or on duty. A lot of workplace violence incidences are caused by triggers. And by triggers, I'm referring to an employee being laid off, even demoted or terminated, job reprimanded, corrective actions, terminations, a negative job performance reviews, no pay raise in 6 years in a row. And this is just some of the ideas that's been developed that discusses triggers. There are 4 categories of workplace violence.
Yeah, you want me to take this one, Larry? This is one of mine.
Go right ahead, Marianna.
Okay. Workplace violence, it consists of not just physical, but also psychological damages. And some examples of workplace violence, they do include those direct physical assaults that we hear a lot about, but that can be with or without a weapon. It could be written or verbal threats, and it could be physical or verbal harassment or even suicides. It can affect not just the employees, but you've got to remember there are going to be clients, customers, visitors. There's going to be other people at that site that may be affected by the workplace violence. But research that's done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, their research has shown that up to 25% of workplace violence is not reported. And some of the things that do make it a little more likely that someone will be a victim of workplace violence and are at higher risk is anybody who works with the public exchanging money, somebody who works alone, somebody who works in an isolated area. All of those increase the potential for violence. People who provide services and care to other people, like the healthcare profession, there is a large amount of workplace violence in healthcare. People who work late at night, or they work in areas where there's high crime rates, those are also risk factors for violence. But there are some high risk or higher risk occupations, and those would be delivery drivers, taxi drivers, healthcare professionals, public service workers, customer service agents, and law enforcement personnel. But NIOSH classifies workplace violence into 4 basic types. Type 1, that's the one that involves criminal intent. In type 1 violence, the perpetrator has no legitimate relationship to the business or to any of its employees. The violence may happen along with another crime. It might be robbery, shoplifting, trespassing, but the violence occurs with that. Acts of terrorism are considered type 1 violence, or the type 1 of workplace violence. Type 2 involves a customer, client, or a patient. So in this type of category, the violent person has a legitimate relationship with the business and becomes violent while receiving services from that business. Type 3, that type involves worker-on-worker relationships and includes an employee or a past employee of the business. All workplaces are at risk for type 3 workplace violence, but workplaces at the higher risk are those who don't conduct criminal background checks as part of their hiring process, and those businesses or those organizations that are downsizing, they're reducing their workforce. So the last type, type 4, that's when violence involves personal relationships. Now that's going to include individuals who have interpersonal relationships with an employee, but no relationship to the business, only the employee. So that category is where domestic violence comes in. People who are assaulted or they're threatened while at work. So angry employees, customers who feel like they've been wronged for something, stressed out employees, or a conflict between coworkers, all of those can escalate to the point of a violent altercation. So, as much as we try to prevent it from happening, personal life does spill over into the workplace. And sometimes, personal issues become workplace issues when they are violent attacks. So companies that recognize the potential for workplace violence, they're the ones that are in the best position to prevent it from happening. The majority of those individuals who commit workplace violence, they have some connection to the business. Those perpetrators, they often have a past or present employment relationship or a personal relationship with an employee. But when it comes to workplace violence, women are overwhelmingly the victims, according to BLS. We're going to talk a little bit about bullying later in this presentation, because sometimes workplace violence is facilitated by employer negligence, including bullying and occupational stress. So we'll cover bullying in just a few minutes. But let's talk about the impact of workplace violence on businesses. 500,000 employees miss an estimated 1.8 million workdays each year due to workplace violence. And that results in $55 million in lost wages. So the annual comprehensive cost of businesses, and that's including their estimated losses, it's now $130 billion. And compare that to in 1995, it was only $36 billion. So SHRM, they do a lot of research on workplace violence, and they list some direct losses to businesses as a result of workplace violence. And those are medical bills, workers' comp costs, legal fees, loss of productivity of their workers, turnover of employees, and then the replacement cost of workers. And there's also, those are the direct cost of businesses. But there are also some indirect losses, and those are decreased morale, among the employees. There is a perceived decrease in safety by employees. There's less trust in coworkers, and there is negative publicity for the business. All of that can damage a company's reputation or their standing in the community, and that's hard to get back. Workplace violence incidents, they're often followed by lawsuits, and that's what Larry's been involved in, quite a few of those. There's often lawsuits and organizations are charged with negligent hiring, negligent retention, negligent supervision, or inadequate security. So when you think about those lawsuits, the average out-of-court settlement for those types of lawsuits is around $500,000. And the average jury award is $3 million. One of the best things, or our best protection that an employer can do, that they can offer to their workers, is to establish a zero-tolerance policy towards workplace violence. Now, it is important to note that OSHA does not require employers to implement workplace violence prevention programs, but they do provide voluntary guidelines, and they may cite employers for failing to provide a safe workplace, and they would be cited under the general duty clause. But OSHA does believe that a well-written and implemented workplace violence prevention program, if that is combined with engineering controls, administrative controls, and proper training, that can reduce the incidence of workplace violence. So what employers can do, they can have a separate, workplace violence prevention program, or they can incorporate it into their safety and health program. They can put it in their employee handbook, or it can be in their manual of standard operating procedures. However they do that, the critical part of it is the training to make sure that everyone on the site understands the program. Larry?
Yes, thank you. Here again, we're talking about, in reference to workplace violence, the workplace is supposed to be an area for productivity, not an area for harassment. Marianna made some excellent points. What I want to talk about now is the various types of threats. There are several types of threats that are made frequently. They're intimidating, they're manipulative, and it's a situation of a person terrorized or being frightened. And it's also forced an action to assert power and control from one person to another. There's direct threats, there's indirect threats, and there's conditional threats. And yes, I'm reading from a reliable source on workplace violence, and I was reading this, the bottom one I just mentioned, conditional threats, where an employee may call up a supervisor and say, if you don't shut down the assembly line tomorrow, I'm going to set a bomb off in the plant. If you remember, I think it was probably about 3 years ago, we had that rash of malware, which was people would lock hold of your computer and not release any of the information until you pay them $500. There's a classic example of conditional threats. Over the years, I've been involved with problems where employees have had issues, whether it be threats of one on another or even their husband or the partner coming into the company. And it does create a set of fear among the employees. And their reactions are that sometimes they feel as though they're either about to be violated or they're walking on eggshells. They're also, you'll find that they're afraid of their abuser. And has the abuser ever physically abused you to a point where you need medical attention? And in most cases, the answer to that is probably yes. Have restraining orders been issued? The restraining order, what I've done in the past with these is to make sure personnel office has a copy of the restraining order, as well as the security guard at the front desk, because you will find one of the partners coming in, and even though the restraining order says you're not allowed within 75 feet of your partner, being in the lobby, and they could be upstairs, they're still within 75 feet. And you know, I have a current case of dealing with a stalker who is madly in love with this woman. She wasn't in love with him, but they both lived in the same building. But when you measured off the distance from one apartment to the elevator and from the elevator to where the woman lived, he was in violation constantly of within the 75 feet rule. And what happened in this case was when the elevator opened up one day, she was about to get on, and he shot her, and then he shot himself. And this is not so much a place of workplace violence, but violence of a couple living together. No restraining order was put in place at that time. So again, you see here security's position and human resources as well as legal department. A lot of people get involved in this when these threats occur, and when and I'm glad Marianna made reference to the establishment of some kind of policy. I didn't really want to get into the concept of standard of care or the reasonableness of security, but if you have programs in place and you have security and HR as well as the law department all continuously monitoring a certain situation, it's far better than them doing nothing. So my next slide here has to do with record keeping. I can't tell you how important I feel that record keeping is. And I've told victims in the past that when it comes down to keeping records, that you need to have some kind of data. You need to know the date and the time phone calls were made or the threats were actually made, how they were made, and exactly what was said. And Marianna had made reference to the fact that we're going to be talking in a few slides about bullying and stalking and harassment. And we both have been involved. We wrote a book on schools, and we included the stalking. The stalking and bullying in schools is tremendous. And we have said, too, that you need to maintain a record as to what happened if you notified, say, as an example, the principal of the school in writing. Keep a copy of that document that you wrote. But the record keeping is certainly important, and especially if it's going to be pursued further in court. Marianna?
Okay, I'm going to, thanks, Larry. I'm going to talk about bullying, harassment, and threats, because a lot of times one of these three things, they can precipitate the workplace violence. So whenever there's an act of workplace violence, there are always people that come out of the woodwork and they say, you know what, I knew that was going to happen. Remember when this happened, this incident, that incident. They talk about prior incidents that lead up to whatever tragedy that happened. So fighting, harassments, threats, or inappropriate behavior, those are just so many of the acts that go unreported, and they could lead to more serious incidents. So about 95% of the time, they're coworkers who were aware of a potentially violent person or situation, but they didn't report it. So unlike harassment, bullying isn't illegal. Bullying comes just like sexual harassment, though. It's uninvited, undeserved, unwarranted. But the difference is harassment hinges on being mistreated based on a protected class, such as your race, your sex, your religion, your national origin. So if bullying behavior is not related to one of those protected classes, it might be a toxic situation in the workplace, but it's not against the law. So the abusive conduct, including verbal abuse, it may be intimidating, it may be threatening, it may be humiliating to the victim. But workplace bullying, it goes far beyond just a small annoyance in the workplace. It creates that psychological power imbalance, and that is between the person who is doing the bullying and their victim. Their victim then begins to develop feelings of helplessness. So 19% of adults say they've been bullied at work. You know, being bullied at work, it can harm both your mental and your physical health. You know, some potential side effects of this, they include stress, anxiety, depression, trauma, and high blood pressure. Now, there are 4 types of workplace bullies. Bullying can come from any direction on the organizational chart, and it can take different forms. So the 4 kinds of workplace bullies are, the first one is an aggressive communicator. And so an aggressive communication bully, they tend to make a public scene, and they instill fear, not only in their target, but also in all their coworkers. The coworkers don't say anything because they fear that they're going to be the next target. So aggressive communication includes yelling, sending angry emails. It could be other forms of verbal hostility towards someone, but it's also using aggressive body language. So a workplace bully, they may not yell at you to your face or in front of other people, but some of them will disparage you so regularly that you begin to doubt your own abilities, and they're going to wear you down so much that the quality of your work might suffer because of it. So this type of bully, they might humiliate you one-on-one or in public. They point out your mistakes constantly. They take credit for your work. They intentionally leave you out of things. They socially isolate you, or they may even play jokes on you. So some bullies do manipulate their targets and withhold resources, and that might be instructions that are needed for a particular job or project. It could be information, it could be time, or help from others. Just basically, some bullies will set you up to fail. You know, that you may get a poor performance review when your work isn't actually so poor. Or maybe you get punished for being 1 minute late to a meeting when there's other people who were late and there weren't any repercussions to them. But one of the most difficult kinds of bullies to detect, and they're the most difficult to deal with, is the one who pretends to be your friend, but they undermine you behind your back. They're controlling your reputation with other people, and they're tearing you to shreds. They call you unreliable, unskilled, this, that. But to your face, they act like you all are friends. So often that bully will ask people to keep their remarks confidential, and people don't tell. That's the problem. It's really hard to combat something when you don't know that it's happening. So one of the reasons is bullies, workplace bullies, they're often high performers, so they get away with it. Whatever it is, they bring value to the company. And that means that the company has an incentive. They want to keep that employee on board, and they want to keep them happy. So if you put that all together, instead of being held accountable for their bullying behavior, these bullies might be getting rewarded. Maybe they're getting a raise. Maybe they're getting a promotion. And that means that their victim is all the more intimidated, and they don't want to tell anybody about the bully. There are two types of sexual harassment claims, quid pro quo and hostile work environment. Quid pro quo means this for that. It involves express or implied demands for sexual favors in exchange for some benefit, like a promotion or a pay increase, or to avoid being terminated or demoted. But quid pro quo harassment is done by someone who's in a position of power or authority. They're over someone. It could be a person's manager. It could be their supervisor that they become the victim of. So hostile work environment harassment, that arises when speech or conduct is so severe and it's so pervasive that it creates an intimidating or demeaning environment for the victim. And that's going to negatively affect that person's job performance. Unlike quid pro quo harassment, this type of harassment can be perpetrated by anyone in the work environment. It could be a peer, a supervisor, a subordinate, a vendor, a customer, or a contractor. So the person might not even be an employee of the company. So some examples of conduct that might create a hostile work environment include inappropriate touching, sexual jokes or comments, repeated requests for dates, and a workplace or a work environment where there are offensive pictures displayed. Prevention is the best tool to eliminate sexual harassment in the workplace. Employers can stop this inappropriate behavior before it reaches the level of harassment, but they have to communicate to their employees that sexual harassment will not be tolerated. They have to conduct training on harassment prevention, and they have to establish an effective complaint process. Okay, if you were an employer, just think about this. You have a business and you are an employer. Do you think your employees would tell you if they were being harassed or threatened on the job? And the answer to that is most of them will not. But there are some top reasons why employees do not report workplace violence. Sometimes the employees are dealing with a bully in the workplace or an angry coworker, and while they don't really like it, they're afraid to really turn that person in or report the situation because they're afraid they're going to be retaliated against. So one thing that employers can do is they need to make it clear to all employees who report workplace violence that they will be supported and they will protect that employee from further harassment, retaliation, or intimidation. And, if you think about since you were a kid, your parents, your coaches, your teachers, we have that ingrained in us not to be a snitch, okay? So in the workplace, many employees, their initial reaction is that they really should report a potentially violent person, But because all of us have been socialized to believe that this is snitching, and they're concerned it may make them look petty and judgmental to other people, so they go against their better judgment and they don't report it. You know, they also fear that they're going to be ostracized by their coworkers, especially if that questionable person is popular among the coworkers. Employers have to teach their employees to be responsible. They have to teach them to report all incidents of workplace violence. An employee may think, what if I don't report this behavior? And this guy comes into work and starts shooting and kills 3 people. Then that employee may feel responsible if they had information that could have prevented that from happening. Some employees are afraid that if they report a potential situation, they may end up involved in a lawsuit, or that person that they reported may file a grievance against them. So some employees state that they're afraid to report potential workplace violence to their supervisor because they think the supervisor may overreact, or they think that they are unable to handle their own job or their own responsibilities that they have. So some employees, they live in constant fear of losing their jobs, you know, especially if there's already been some issues and they're on thin ice with their supervisor for any reason at all. But if employers will create a reporting policy that allows employees who fear their supervisor or who think that their supervisor will not take action, they can bypass that supervisor and go up the chain of command and report it that way. Employees they often become complacent when they deal with problem children in the workplace, and all of us have worked with people like that in different workplaces. You know, somebody's bad behavior, you know, is it just their temperament? Or maybe people believe that their behavior doesn't need to be reported because it'll just blow over, or that's just how they are. Everybody knows it. It's no big deal. A lot of times that's what people think. So, but that is an incredibly dangerous situation because since potentially violent people, they hold the power and they're controlling an office based on fear. So employers have to train their employees to recognize that this type of behavior is in fact workplace violence, and it must be reported. The problem is always the same. If no one reports the behavior, no one is able to connect the dots and see the full threat. We hear that terminology a lot, connecting the dots, and that's exactly what happens. So if an employee is supposed to tell someone, who are they supposed to tell? Is it their supervisor, the violent person supervisor, somebody in HR, the vice president of HR? What about confidentiality? If they report the behavior, is the entire office going to be talking about that then? There has to be a reporting procedure in any workplace violence policy. Employers need to let their employees know very clearly who they need to report to and how to report it. Employees also have to have a clear understanding of what workplace violence is. Sometimes they don't realize that it is workplace violence. And they also need to know what the warning signs are and how to handle a potentially violent situation. So too many companies have workplace violence policies, and employees come in, maybe new hires come in, and they sign off on those policies even when there's no real understanding about the policy. So what happens is employers need to think about if they have employees who are not reporting incidents, that will let them see what gaps they have, where they need to fill that in. They may need to make certain that all supervisors and employees are on the same page when it comes to workplace violence. Larry talked about OSHA earlier, and according to OSHA, about 2 million people each year report some type of workplace violence. And according to the National Safety Council, the 4th leading cause of deaths at work is from assaults. Larry also talked a little bit about trigger of events. I'm going to kind of follow up to that just a little bit. But there are some reasons that violence occurs in the workplace. You know, companies that do not conduct thorough background screenings on potential employees run the risk of hiring someone who could be prone to violence or has a violent past. Some companies they're trying to use these psychological tests during the hiring process because they're doing that in an attempt to weed out the potentially violent candidates. But that test, you can't substitute that for a thorough background check. But unfortunately, you know, when you have a business and employees that come into work, they don't leave their personal issues at the door when they come to work. That personal stress may cause that employee to snap and lash out at somebody they work with. If there is an employee assistance program, an EAP, possibly the situation can be diffused with a potentially violent employee before the employee does something that is violent. Most employees become violent as a last resort when they feel that nobody is addressing or acknowledging their needs. But if there is an EAP program in place, employees then they're going to have an impartial party that they can talk to about the stressors in their life. And maybe they can receive the assistance or the treatment that they need before things escalate into a violent situation. Some companies do take the approach that nothing bad will happen. In all of the shootings, and particularly the school shootings, and Larry and I have done a lot of research on that, there's always people that say, I never thought it would happen here. That is that comment happens almost every time. So, but when people have that ignorance about the potential for violence, that means they're not, there's no safety and there is no conflict resolution. There's nothing in place that can diffuse that situation. So a person who feels a company has wronged them in some way, they may want to lash out at the company. It could be a customer who feels he was cheated. It could be an employee who was fired, laid off, or feels like he was treated unfairly by a coworker. Employers are getting more concerned that their employees know how to de-escalate a situation and possibly prevent it from becoming violent. There is a popular program called Crisis Prevention Intervention, and I teach that class. And what it does, it teaches people how to recognize and safely manage difficult behaviors. You know, people learn how to communicate effectively. They learn about body language. They learn about paraverbal communication. But the big thing is that they need to learn to de-escalate a dangerous or a violent situation. Larry?
Yep, thank you. I want to go off script for a minute because Marianna said a lot of great things just a couple of minutes ago. And what occurs to me is the one word, responsibilities. Who's responsible for this? And as she was speaking, I'm thinking there must be somebody in the audience that's saying, who's responsible for this? And specific responsibility goes back to what I said earlier, security working with HR. There has to be a partnership there. That a lot of corporations have town hall meetings with all of their employees. And even as Marianna said, a new employee comes in, you need to show them what the policies and procedures are as it pertains to workplace violence. And at the very early stages of their employment, let them feel comfortable with meeting you in HR and also being aware of the fact that they now have met someone that possibly they can talk to if they have a problem. The training that goes on, and we'll be talking about that a little later on, security and employees have to be involved in the training, not as more or less as presenters, but just to be aware so that everybody is on the same page. Marianna mentioned about having a zero policy as it pertains to stalking, harassment, and unprofessional behavior. I know that there's a famous clause that has to do with ethics, so that if somebody does something that's not ethical, I don't care what the phraseology is you want to use, as long as it's strong enough to be effective, and could possibly be a justification for termination. But responsibility, if I didn't mention this, I would feel kind of negligent in sort of our duty as making these presentations. Stalking. Certainly there's been a lot said in the past that deals with bullying and stalking. It happens to adults. It's not just children. It's not just one teenage girl on another teenager that is a classmate and that happens to be in the same class. But it comes in many forms, even for adults. I had an employee once that was, how can I phrase it? She felt that she was being stalked by someone and left notes on the windshield of her car and then keyed her door. She was more upset about the damage to her car than the note. But we were able to determine exactly who the person was because the parking lot we had total closed-circuit TV all over the place from one end of the parking lot to the other, and which was a great help for us. So stalking is a behavior that does go on, and it takes place all the time. And my next slide here has to do with fear. And I mentioned part of fear. This dealing with fear is a very complicated deal, but it requires a lot of understanding on the part of the presenter. HR can do what they can to reduce the fear by talking very calmly to the employee, filing a report with the police, calling in the person who's doing the abusing, and dealing with the issue and not just washing it under a rug. We now come to a point in our presentation where we're going to talk about some case studies. And we put together quite a few of these. And Marianna and I have known each other for over 10 years now. We've written together about, I think it's 7 books, Marianna, if I remember correctly. And we were originally going to be talking about the Pulse nightclub. And then Marianna mentioned, gee, that's not a workplace violence situation. That's more of an active shooter situation. But it's a workplace violence situation for the bartenders and the waitress and the owner of the establishment in comparison to just a straight active shooter cases. So we're going to talk about the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida. And we also added the West Freeway Church in Texas. And where was the other one? The train. And up in Canada, in Nova Scotia. Yeah, there it is, the bottom one, Nova Scotia, where 23 people are dead. So Marianne, why don't you cover the first one?
Okay. And this one received a lot of publicity with this Naval Air Station. That's when, and this was just in December of 2019, that's when there was a Saudi Air Force student he killed 3, shot 8, and then killed himself. But that shooting occurred in a classroom building on the base. And the base stayed on lockdown for a long period of time until there was a full investigation done. But what is kind of scary about this shooting is, most people would think that our military bases, that they're one of the most secure places, and that nothing like this, no shooting could happen because of the security procedures that they have in place. So every time that there is a shooting, whether it's workplace violence or whether it's active shooter or a combination of those, there is always an after-action report. And in that after-action report, that's where we get the best practices. That's where we get the lessons learned or what can be done to maybe prevent this from happening in the future. But at the Naval Air Station, the FBI investigated that case, and it was a pretty big base. 16,000 military, 7,400 civilians worked there. But what's kind of interesting is this shooting in Pensacola, it was just 2 days after a shooting incident at Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard in Hawaii. So here we've got two of them within just a very short period of time. But the big lesson learned for this, for the military is that they had two major active shooter incidents at naval facilities, and they both occurred in a 4-day period. So that means that something is not working with their system. Something's not working with their policies, their procedures, their training programs. Okay? So I think as a result of this, we're going to see more changes with the military. And it's not going to be the Navy, but it's going to be all branches of the military where things become a little more locked down. There's stricter policies and procedures in place. Okay, Larry, you want to talk about one?
Yes, I'm going to talk about now for a few minutes about the West Freeway Church of Christ in Fort Worth, Texas, where 3 people were shot and 2 were dead. And there was one person who was in very critical condition, and this became an active shooter case. The Fort Worth Fire Department spokesperson said that the agency sent out an active shooter assignment about 11:30, and it was the scene to assist the local police department. There was one person who was dead at the scene, and the second was critical. The ambulances arrived and they took all parties to the hospital. According to CNN, a witness said that a gunman walked up to the server during communion and fired and started shooting. And there was a person in the church itself who was also a police officer handling security for the church at that particular moment. He drew his gun, fired a shot, and killed the person. It was quoted by an individual there that it was the most scariest thing. You feel like your life is flashing before you, and I was so worried about my little child. The Freeway Church was also live streaming its services at the time of the attack, and the parishioners were mostly hiding behind the pews and trying to duck in sort of a cover. One of the other parts of this particular case, and why we also brought it to your attention, is the fact that it was somebody had recorded it with their cameras and put it on YouTube. And so when you have some of these cases that you may be filing, let me suggest to you that you do check with YouTube in the event that there's a possibility that you have the live streaming of the whole presentation. Next, we're going to talk to you about Coors Beer Factory. Marianne?
Yeah. Okay. This one occurred when there was an employee of Coors. A guy had been terminated, and then he came back with a gun, and he shot and killed 5 other employees before he killed himself. And so there are some things. We got to think about these lessons learned and best practices. There are some things that the law enforcement there did absolutely right. They closed the schools that are close to the brewery. They were all locked down. They warned all the residents to stay away from the area, to shelter in place in their homes. They continued to search the Coors campus for hours after the shooting to make sure they didn't miss anything. So there's been a lot of talk about what precipitated this attack. It was reported that there was a noose placed on the shooter's locker 5 years before when he was not working. He didn't even know until somebody called. The HR team called him and said that it was there, and they investigated it. But the problem was there was no camera footage to see who placed it there. HR said that they offered the shooter some services, security services, and also some counseling, but he refused. So, the brewery leadership, they said that everybody knew about the confidential ways to share discrimination or harassment complaints, but obviously there was a breakdown there. The company said that it was not aware of any complaints made by the shooter to HR or management, anything about racial harassment. And so the company also said that there were no active EEOC race-based harassment or discrimination complaints. So the company very quickly came back to defending themselves. Okay, so the lessons learned from the Coors shooting is that terminations with a potential for violence, they always have an armed security officer or an off-duty police officer present, and they need to be in there at the meeting. So, you know, obviously when you think about this shooting, there was no access control, there was no weapons check at any of the doors, and so the shooter was just allowed to enter the facility. Handheld metal detectors could also be used when there's a termination situation. So at Coors now they're doing damage control. So they want to make employees feel safe at work. So there's armed officers in all their lobbies. There's increased security officers. They're checking bags. But unfortunately, all of that was a little too late for the situation that's already occurred. But if a threat assessment or a physical security assessment had been done, maybe the company could have determined that they needed more reasonable security measures in place, and they needed to look at their culture of safety and security. Is it what they thought it was? So these after-action reports, those are the best practices, and a lot of times they tell people whether or not their emergency communications, their mass notification system, did it work? And they got to remember they need to communicate with family members, especially the family members of the employees that were killed. You got to know what community resources you can use. Another one is to make sure that IT systems are backed up off-site. You need to plan for a location for business operations because you're not going to be able to get back in that building or on that floor until the investigation is complete. But, you know, the physical and the emotional recovery of workplace violence or a workplace shooter, you know, that goes on for months and years. So, Larry, do we have time to cover another one, Nadja? Do you want to talk about one, Larry?
8 minutes left. We have 8 minutes left, and we do have a few questions, so you do have time to go through.
I'll be short. This is going to sound almost bizarre, and this happened on April 2nd. What was referred to as an angry locomotive engineer derailing his train in an attempt to try to ram a Navy hospital ship because he was obsessed with the coronavirus conspiracy. The guy was arrested and faced charges. We brought this up to talk to you about it, and if anybody wants copies of these, I'll be happy to send them to you. It's basically, it gives you an idea of the craziness and how someone who is just a notch mentally imbalanced goes off the deep end. The fifth one is an active shooter case where 23 people were dead in Nova Scotia. The active shooter in Nova Scotia, Canada, went on a rampage and killed 23 people over the weekend, and this was April 22nd of this year. Many of the random victims were shot in 16 locations, and he also set fire to 5 houses before he was shot and killed by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police at a gas station. It's basically the worst shooting in the history of Canada. But let me read you this one line. Investigators are now saying that the rampage may have started as a domestic violence dispute with his former partner. Her house was one of the 5 houses that was burnt to the ground. And this is this is new. This is fairly new to see arson be implemented into domestic violence and even if to a degree workplace violence. So with that said, and I'll adjourn my presentation, I sincerely want to thank everybody for being part of our program today. I hope we didn't scare you. That was not our intent. Our intent was to expose you to some of the problems and some of the case studies that we put together. So let's deal with any questions that the group may have, and we'll be here as long as necessary.
Awesome.
Nadja?
Thank you, Larry and Marianna. Yep, I got it. If everyone could type in the passcode, that'd be perfect. Our first question, did you say that the 4th leading cause of death at work is employee violence? Can you provide that study to us?
That would have been the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS.
Okay. Next question, regarding defendants or employers firing employees for threatening violence against his supervisors and coworkers, and then the fired employee sues the defendant or employer for discrimination. Are there any studies of what % of juries have found the employee sues the defendant discrimination? Are there any studies of what % of juries have found for the defendant's employers?
I'm not aware of any, but I think that if the employee has a set of policies and procedures that is spelled out, and when the new employee comes on to the corporation, that they sign that they have read and received such documents, it gives management and the defense in the case an edge. You know, one of the things that I was thinking of, and I mentioned the phraseology, and I know attorneys know what it is when I talk about standard of care. Assume for a minute that some of these companies do nothing, do absolutely nothing. And look at those that as we have mentioned about training and town hall meetings and the drafting of policies and procedures. That's basically what the norm is. And so you have some companies that do it, and a lot of companies that don't do it. And we're going to see more and more lawsuits as a result of this virus. Mark my word, they're starting to develop now. Next question.
Okay. Does case law indicate that employers have an established duty to act if they are advised of a situation of violence?
Does case law say that they have a duty? I think they have a duty to provide a reasonably safe environment for all employees, for everyone that's there. I've worked in some large companies ranging from 1,500 to a company like IBM over the years. And these companies do hold town meetings, and it only takes a few minutes to discuss some phase of workplace violence or various issues pertaining to employees' health and safety.
Okay, next question. Would armed teachers reduce death of active school shooters?
I got to say no.
Boy, that's a hot button issue.
Yeah, that is a hot button issue, is right. Being on the American Society for Industrial Security's School Safety and Security Council, this was brought up. Let me explain to you the problem. Both Marianna and I have been in our past life sworn police officers. I have been trained to use a Glock 9mm handgun. Now, this is a gun that holds 15 bullets plus one in the chambers for a total of 16, and you normally have about 2 or 3 clips on your belt. Now, my training was, say, twice a year, and we would shoot at the beginning maybe as much as 100 rounds, if not 500 rounds. Take all of the teachers in the country, and now we're going to put together a training program. You cannot give a teacher an untrained in the use of firearms. It just can't be done. They don't know how to shoot. You're going to take them to the range. Look at the cost of, I'm going to make this up. Look at the cost of, say, 5,000 teachers in the state of New York. Now, that's 5,000 handguns. And Marianna, give me a figure. How much does one Glock handgun cost about?
Just say $500.
500.
Or just an easy number.
800 to 12. By the time you get the holster and you get the additional clips and the time you buy the bullets. So even if we round it off and say it's $1,000 times 5,000 teachers, and it's going to take days of training, I'm telling you, some of these teachers do not want to be involved, and they do not want to be carrying a handgun. And it's like having, let's give guns to the janitors if we're going to go be that crazy and give them to teachers. Where do we draw the line? So I'll say that this has been discussed, and the answer is no. Do not give teachers a handgun.
Well, I know the consensus of the School Safety and Security Council is against arming teachers. And we kind of look at it from the standpoint of let people do what they do best. Let teachers teach. Let's let law enforcement be law enforcement.
I can tell you this as part of the answer to this. We put together a paper which we wrote, A Common Sense Approach to Active Shooter. And all I can say is common sense has to be used when it comes to this type of a response to active shooter. I hope I answered your question.
So we do have a follow-up question for that, and it is, why not give trained teachers the option, whether or not they want to carry and be armed?
Okay, then, you know what also has to be done is that you have to talk to the local chief of police and bring him into the conversation so that he's aware of the fact. And if you can get him to approve putting guns in the hands of teachers in your little towns, so be it. But I don't think any chief of police is going to put his name on that requisition. There's a cost factor to this. If the schools cannot afford pencils and papers and various books and supplies, how are they ever going to be supplying handguns to teachers and to other personnel?
Right. All right, I have one last question. It's actually my question. So say you're in a small office and you try to get a restraining order on someone who is harassing you. How does that work? Small office, meaning about 25 employees, and, maybe you're all on one floor working together. Would someone have to vacate the job? Would they have to leave?
No, whatever the restraining order, you need to make sure that the employer has a copy of it, and then whoever the receptionist is or the person in the front office, they need to be aware of it. They need to have a photograph of this person, and there needs to be access control so that person won't have access into the offices against the person who has the restraining order on.
But what if it's the person you work with? Like, what if it's one of your employees? Yes.
Then I think you're going, like we said earlier, you're going to have to go to the head of personnel and say, look, I have a problem with Louis in my office or whoever it might be, and explain all of the facts to personnel, and then make it become a personnel issue.
Mm-hmm.
And if they do have a zero policy, then they have to go along with what their policy is automatically.
That makes sense.
And if this doesn't work, then I would strongly suggest to you to contact a lawyer, and to have the lawyer even accompany you, if necessary, to the personnel office.
I thought you were talking about someone outside the company. That's what I answered, so I apologize.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you both for answering those questions. Those were all of the ones we had. So I wanted to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Larry and Marianna for their time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with Larry and Marianna, or if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding an expert witness for a case that you are working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319. One of my colleagues will be following up with you regarding your feedback on today's presentation. And don't forget, too, at the end of this, please fill out the survey for your CLE certificate, which I'm hoping to have to you by next week. This concludes our presentation, and thank you, everyone, for attending.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadja.
Mm-hmm.